I never thought it would happen to me. I had always been the kind of person who was prepared, who knew how to stay calm in a tough situation. But that morning, I found myself hopelessly lost in the middle of a dense forest. No idea how to get back, and every step I took seemed to make things worse. It started innocently enough. I had decided to take a solo hike in the woods near my cabin. The area wasn't unfamiliar to me. I'd hiked here a few times, enjoyed the solitude, the quiet, but that day something felt different. I wasn't sure if it was the weather, unusually overcast for this time of year, or if it was just the growing feeling that I should have stayed home, but I pushed it aside. I needed the fresh air, the escape. I parked my car near the trailhead and set out around 9 in the morning. The temperature was cool, but comfortable enough with a light jacket. The path was well worn at first, a clear trail marked with yellow blazes on the trees. I felt confident. There was a rustling in the trees above, and I could hear birds calling to each other as I walked along the trail, my boots crunching the dry leaves underfoot. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the peace, the stillness of the woods. I passed the first mile marker, then the second. By now, the trail was winding through thicker trees, and the usual path was becoming less clear. But I had my map and compass, so I wasn't too worried. I'd hiked in areas where the trail wasn't as defined. I had learned to rely on my instincts and keep my bearings. But as I glanced at the map, something seemed off. I couldn't quite place it, but I felt like I'd missed a turn somewhere. The markers on the trees had become sparse, and the path didn't seem to match up with what I remembered. Still, I pressed on. Another hour passed, and the atmosphere had shifted. The light filtering through the trees had dimmed, and the once lively sounds of birds and insects seemed to have faded into silence. My surroundings felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening. My stomach knotted as I tried to follow the path, but every way I looked seemed to blur into an endless sea of trees. I pulled out my compass again. It didn't seem to be helping much, nothing felt right. I took a deep breath and retraced my steps, trying to find a sign of the trail I might have missed. I had a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something that told me I had wandered too far off course. After another half hour of walking, it became clear I wasn't just a little lost. I was completely off track. Panic set in, but I fought it back. I knew that wasn't going to help me. I needed to stay calm, think logically. I pulled out the map again, but it didn't make sense. The landmarks I was looking for weren't matching up with what I saw around me. The dense forest had started to feel like a maze. I'd been hiking for hours now, and every direction I turned felt the same. The woods stretched endlessly, trees and underbrush, the occasional rock or fallen log. Nothing else. I checked my phone, no signal. The battery was still half full, but that wasn't going to help me without a signal. I was on my own. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows through the trees. My anxiety spiked. I hadn't planned to be out here this long. I thought about making camp for the night, but I couldn't stop the creeping worry that something would go wrong if I didn't find my way out soon. I forced myself to stop and think. In situations like this, I knew the key was to make slow, deliberate decisions. But my heart was racing, and the thought of being stuck here overnight was too much to handle. The longer I stayed out here, the harder it would be to get back. I decided to keep walking in the direction I thought I'd come from. I wasn't sure anymore if I was retracing my steps or walking deeper into the wilderness. But I had to try. Hours passed. The forest felt even more alien now. The shadows were longer, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to stave off the chill that was settling in my bones. My mind started to wander. I thought about the things I'd left behind: my car, the cabin, the warmth of my bed. I regretted not telling anyone where I was going. I regretted not staying on the well-marked trail. But regret didn't do much for me now. Nightfall came quickly. The forest, once beautiful and tranquil, had become a hostile place. The sounds of the day had given way to eerie silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the rustle of leaves. Every time I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, I spun around, only to find nothing. It felt like the trees themselves were closing in on me, like the forest was swallowing me whole. I stumbled across a small clearing and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was so tired. My legs ached, my stomach growled, and my thoughts were becoming muddled. I knew I needed to make a decision. Either I built a shelter and waited for daylight, or I kept moving. I didn't know which was the better choice, but I decided to press on. Just as I started to walk again, I saw a faint light in the distance. It wasn't bright, but it was unmistakable. A soft, warm glow flickered like a campfire. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Someone was out here. I pushed myself toward the light, faster than I should have. My heart was pounding now, the exhaustion almost unbearable, but the thought of human contact gave me new strength. The light grew larger as I got closer, until I could see the outlines of a campfire through the trees. When I finally reached the clearing, I stopped short. The campfire was real, but the scene before me wasn't what I expected. A man sat by the fire, hunched over, his back to me. The fire crackled, sending out bursts of warmth, but the man didn't move. I called out, but he didn't respond. I took a cautious step forward, but something made me hesitate. The firelight cast strange, flickering shadows on the trees, and it wasn't until I got closer that I saw what was wrong. The man wasn't alone. Around the fire were several packs, some open and spilling with supplies. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something that froze me in my tracks. The ground around the fire was marked with deep grooves, like something had been dragged through the dirt. I turned to leave, but my legs were stiff, my feet unwilling to move. A loud crack of a branch snapped through the silence, and I spun around. The man was still sitting by the fire, his back turned, but now I saw something else. A figure behind him, in the shadows, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced my legs to move, backing away slowly. My mind raced. I wasn't alone out here. The light, the fire, everything had been a trap. I hadn't been lost. I had walked right into something I couldn't understand. As I turned and ran, I heard the shuffle of footsteps behind me, then the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, breaking through the underbrush in pursuit. My heart thudded in my chest. Every breath felt sharp and desperate, but I didn't stop running. I had no idea how long I ran. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But I kept going, driven by the terror that whatever had been waiting by the fire wasn't going to let me get away. Finally, when I thought I couldn't run another step, I stumbled into a small trail, narrow, but it was a trail, and it was something I recognized. I knew this path. I had walked it before. Without thinking, I sprinted down it, pushing myself forward. The sounds of pursuit faded as I ran, but I didn't dare look back. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods, the familiar clearing where I had started, that I finally stopped. I was out of breath, shaking uncontrollably, but I was safe. Looking back at the forest, I couldn't see any sign of the man or the fire. It was just the woods again, quiet, still, and dark. But I knew better than to trust it. I knew I had narrowly escaped something, and I wasn't going back. I made it to my car, and I drove straight home without stopping, never once looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. No one would believe me anyway. They'd say I had gotten disoriented, that my mind had played tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I will never step foot in those woods again. The day had started like any other. The sun was rising lazily over the hills, casting a soft golden light through the trees. I had been meaning to hike these woods for a while. They weren't too far from where I lived, just a quiet patch of nature with trails that went deep into the forest. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, mostly because it wasn't that serious. Just a morning hike to clear my head. I'd been walking for a while, nothing extraordinary, just the steady crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The air was thick with the smell of earth and pine, and the wind was gentle, more of a whisper than a breeze. The quiet was comforting, but a part of me felt a little uneasy. The woods felt different today, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I had started on a marked trail, but after a few miles, I began veering off the path. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just a sudden urge to see what lay beyond the beaten track. The trees were thick and the light dimmed under their canopy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I wasn't lost, not yet. I figured I could always retrace my steps if I needed to. The first sign that something was wrong came when I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in what felt like ages. I stopped and glanced around. Nothing. No sign of a trail, no markers on the trees, nothing to suggest I was going the right way. For a moment, I considered turning back, but I shrugged it off. There were enough landmarks, big rocks, fallen trees, that I could navigate without the markers. But then, it happened again. The trees seemed to change. It was subtle at first. The pine trees I had been walking through were replaced by something darker, taller. Oaks, I think. Their gnarled branches twisted against the sky, casting odd shadows on the forest floor. The air felt colder too, and I suddenly realized I hadn't seen a single animal since I'd gone off the trail. No birds, no squirrels, not even the rustle of insects. My stomach tightened, and a small knot formed in my chest. I pulled out my phone, but there was no service. Not surprising. The signal was usually weak in these parts, but I usually didn't need it. I'd gotten used to being out here alone, enjoying the silence. But today felt different. I pressed forward, telling myself it was just my imagination. The woods had a way of doing that, playing tricks on you. After what felt like another hour of walking, the landscape didn't look familiar. The trees were closing in on me, and the path had completely disappeared. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but nothing seemed right. There were no distinguishing features anymore. No rocks or fallen logs to mark where I had been. Just the endless stretch of the same dense trees. That's when the panic set in. I'd been walking for a long time now, and I wasn't sure where I was. The woods had turned darker, and the feeling of isolation hit me full force. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive, as if the woods were closing in on me. I tried retracing my steps, but the trees all looked the same. I started walking faster, trying to calm my breath, trying to think logically. This wasn't the first time I had been lost. I had gotten turned around in the woods before, but I'd always found my way out. Always. The hours slipped by, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky. The woods felt colder, and I realized I should have packed more for the hike.
No jacket, no flashlight.
Just me, my phone, and a bottle of water that was now half empty. The idea of nightfall in the woods was starting to frighten me, but I didn't want to admit it. I just had to find a way out. I kept walking, faster now, each footstep seeming louder than the last, echoing in the emptiness. There was nothing but the sound of my own breath and the occasional crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Every now and then, I would stop, hoping to hear something, anything, something that would tell me I wasn't alone. But it never came. I stumbled over a rock, cursing under my breath. My ankle throbbed, and for a moment, I just sat on the ground, clutching it. My phone was still useless, the battery slowly draining. I tried again to make a call, but it was pointless. I had no idea how long I had been out here by the time I heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder. A crackling sound, like twigs snapping underfoot. It wasn't an animal, though. No animal moved like that. The sound was too deliberate, too human. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening, my breath catching in my throat. The cracking of branches stopped, but I was sure I wasn't alone anymore. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the darkened forest. I wanted to scream, but I held it in. My brain was telling me to move, to run, to get away, but I couldn't seem to make my legs cooperate. Then, as suddenly as the noise had appeared, it was gone. For a few moments, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. The silence felt heavier now. The woods weren't just silent. They were watching me. I stood up, my ankle still throbbing, and began walking again. This time, I made sure to keep my eyes open for any sign of civilization. A road, a building, anything that could lead me back. The fear was growing now, spreading like cold fingers down my spine. The trees around me seemed to close in tighter, blocking the path ahead. And then, finally, through the underbrush, I spotted something. A break in the trees, a small clearing. I rushed toward it, my pulse quickening. As I got closer, I could see it was just a small patch of land, no more than 20 feet wide. But in the center, there was something that made my heart skip. A cabin. It wasn't much. A rundown little shack with a sagging roof and peeling paint. But it was a cabin, and that meant people. That meant help. I approached cautiously, my legs unsteady beneath me. I reached for the door, hesitating for just a moment. It creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. But it was safe. I was safe. I didn't know who had left this cabin here or why, but at that moment I didn't care. I locked the door behind me and sat down on the cold, dusty floor. My head was spinning, my breath shallow. I closed my eyes for just a moment, and when I opened them again, the light was fading outside. But I was no longer afraid. The cabin had given me something the woods couldn't, a sense of safety. I sat there for hours, just breathing. Eventually, the thought struck me, I was going to make it out of here. And it was going to be okay. Tomorrow, I would find my way back, find the trail. I would tell people about the woods, about the odd feeling, about the strange sounds. But none of that mattered right now, because for the first time all day, I felt calm. I was no longer lost. I'd been hiking for hours when the sun started to dip beneath the horizon. The warm, late afternoon light had turned into something more muted, more gray, and I had just realized I wasn't sure where I was. The trail I'd been following had split at some point, and I, in my usual overconfidence, chose to take the path less traveled. It was supposed to be a scenic detour, a quick jaunt through the woods to get away from the crowds, to find a peaceful spot for some quiet reflection. I'd never expected to end up lost. The first few signs weren't alarming, just a misturn, a slight change in the underbrush that didn't feel familiar. But soon, those small shifts turned into something larger. The trees grew denser, the trail harder to follow, and the sounds of the forest seemed to close in on me. I checked my phone an hour ago, but the signal was weak. I tried again, hoping for a miracle, but it was hopeless. I had no GPS, no map, and no way to figure out where I was. The temperature had started to drop, the air feeling heavier, colder. I wrapped my jacket tighter around my shoulders, trying to hold on to the last remnants of warmth. The trail had been so clear when I began, but now it felt like it was disappearing under my feet. The dirt path had given way to uneven ground, rocks jutting out from the earth like teeth, and fallen branches that made every step a bit more dangerous. I knew I should have turned around hours ago, but my stubbornness kept me pushing forward. Couldn't give up. Not now. With each step, the woods grew darker. The trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out what little light was left from the sky. The wind had picked up, rustling through the canopy overhead, sending leaves scattering across the path. The rustling felt almost unnerving, like something was moving with me, just out of sight. I stopped trying to listen. It was hard to distinguish the natural sounds of the forest from the whispers in my own head. A distant bird call, the snap of a twig somewhere off to my left. The sounds seemed too deliberate, too loud, too close. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just an animal, a deer or something small, maybe a squirrel. But as the minutes stretched on, I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling of being watched. I pulled out my phone once more, praying for a signal, any signal. The screen was blank, no bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. Just the same empty, hopeless emptiness. I tucked it back into my pocket and kept moving. It wasn't long before I realized that the world around me had changed. The woods, which had once seemed welcoming and serene, now felt menacing. The shadows of the trees were deep, too deep, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. There was no trail anymore, just a series of scattered footprints, mine, I guessed, but they didn't seem to lead anywhere. The trees loomed over me like silent watchers, their twisted branches gnarled and reaching out, trying to pull me deeper into the unknown. I had to find a way out. The darkness grew quickly. My breath came in shallow gasps, not from exertion but from the growing panic gnawing at my insides. The forest wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It was alive. It was closing in. I could hear the soft crunch of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone or something was following me, waiting for me to slip up. My heart raced. There was no time to be afraid. I pushed forward, scanning the ground for some sign of a path, a marker, anything to tell me where I was. But there was nothing. Only trees, rocks, and the sound of my own footsteps. I stumbled over a root, catching myself on a tree trunk before I hit the ground. The thud of my body against the bark rang out in the quiet, and I froze. The noise seemed to echo unnaturally, stretching out, reverberating through the woods like a warning. The chill in the air was sharper now, and I could see my breath in the fading light. The wind howled above me, but on the ground, everything felt still, too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was close now, something moving just out of sight. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every rustling leaf set my heart pounding. I wanted to scream, but I didn't know why. I didn't know who or what I was screaming for. The trees had grown so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. The forest had swallowed me whole, and I felt like I was walking through a maze with no way out. The darkness was closing in, the night creeping through the cracks between the trees, and the air seemed to press down on me with increasing weight. I kept walking. I had to. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen if I stopped. If I sat down and gave up, would I just disappear, lost to the woods forever? Would I be one of those stories, one of those cautionary tales they tell around campfires? Or worse, would I become a part of the woods, just another shadow that wandered aimlessly, forgotten by time? I tripped again, this time falling hard on my hands and knees. My palms scraped against the rough ground, and I gasped in pain, but there was no time to think about that. I pushed myself up, wiping the dirt from my hands. The wind was picking up now, howling through the trees, carrying with it the scent of wet leaves and something else, something almost metallic. My head swam as I stood there, trying to steady myself, trying to clear my thoughts. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I started moving again, it was with a renewed sense of urgency. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. The more I walked, the more the woods seemed to twist around me, the path growing more and more indistinct. What had once felt like a simple detour now felt like an endless labyrinth, a maze of trees with no way out. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, clearing, a small patch of grass, a break in the trees. I could see the sky again, the first stars poking through the darkening night. I felt my heart leap in my chest, a surge of hope flooding through me. This was it. This had to be it. I sprinted forward, breaking through the last line of trees, and there it was, a road. A real road, a paved one with headlights approaching in the distance. Relief flooded through me, and I collapsed to my knees, unable to stop the tears that welled up in my eyes. I had made it. I was free. The woods hadn't swallowed me. I hadn't become just another lost soul. A car pulled up beside me, the headlights blinding for a moment before the driver's window rolled down. A man, looking concerned but friendly, leaned out. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, barely able to speak. All I could do was point to the woods behind me, where the trees stood silent and still. The man didn't seem to need any further explanation. He reached over, opened the passenger door, and I climbed in. As the car pulled away from the woods, I glanced back. The trees were just trees. The shadows were just shadows. And I was just me, no longer lost, no longer afraid. Just home. I woke up to a thick fog hanging low over the ground, a fog that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. The trees around me were nothing but silhouettes, their outlines barely visible through the mist. I had no idea how I'd gotten here, no memory of the hike, the path, or even when I last checked my phone for the time. It was just me and the fog, the cold and damp air, and a growing sense of dread. I took a deep breath, hoping the fog might lift soon, but the chill in the air seemed to only make it worse. My shoes squelched against the muddy earth as I tried to stand up, my legs stiff from whatever sleep or unconsciousness had held me. The ground was wet beneath me, and I looked around, trying to piece together what was happening. How had I ended up here? The last thing I remembered was the trailhead at the edge of the forest. I'd come out here to get some fresh air, away from the city and all its noise. I'd planned on following a well-marked path, the kind that would loop back to where I started after a few hours. I'd read about the trail online. Perfect for beginners, they'd said. Simple, beautiful views, they'd promised. I had no reason to believe anything could go wrong. But now, I had no idea which way to go. I glanced around the forest, the trees just barely visible through the thick mist. There was a faint path leading off into the woods in front of me, but the ground was so slick that my first few steps nearly made me slip. I wiped the mud off my pants and steadied myself before walking slowly forward. The mist was oppressive. Every few steps I'd expect the fog to clear, but instead, it felt like it just grew thicker, pressing down on me. My breath came out in short bursts, forming little clouds of white vapor in the air. The air was too cold for comfort, but my jacket wasn't much protection. I hadn't dressed for a trip this long. I checked my watch. The time seemed off, like it wasn't moving, or maybe it was just the panic setting in. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't packed enough food for an extended journey. I'd planned to be back by noon, but now the sun had shifted. How long had I been out here? I had no idea. I tried to calm myself down. There were always people on these trails, right? There had to be. I kept telling myself that I was fine, that I could just walk back and everything would be okay. But the longer I walked, the more I doubted that idea. I'd expected the trail to be straight and easy to follow. But as I looked around, the trees looked all the same, tall, dark, and unchanging. Every direction seemed identical. Nothing looked familiar. I pulled out my phone, trying to check for a signal, but it was dead. I cursed under my breath and shoved it back into my pocket. I walked for what felt like hours, but time had become irrelevant. My legs burned, my feet were sore, and my head was starting to ache. Every time I looked around, the fog seemed to be swallowing the trees whole, turning everything into one gray blur. The path, if there even was one anymore, was hard to see. It could have easily been an animal trail or nothing at all. I stopped for a moment, my heart pounding, a lump in my throat. I needed to find something, anything, a marker, a sign, anything that could tell me where I was. There had to be something. I wasn't completely lost. I refused to believe it. In the distance, I thought I saw something, a dark figure. Maybe it was a person, or another tree. My mind played tricks on me. I took a step closer, squinting through the mist. It was nothing, just another patch of trees, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky. Nothing more. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I couldn't afford to waste time. The cold was biting, and the fog didn't seem to be lifting. I was getting dizzy now. The hunger, the tiredness, the overwhelming sense of confusion. It was all adding up. Another hour passed, maybe more. I could no longer tell. The daylight was dimming, the thick fog making it impossible to gauge how much time had passed. The trees around me seemed to close in, and I could feel the weight of the woods pressing against me. My legs were giving out, my muscles weak and trembling. I found myself leaning against a tree for support, my breath coming fast and shallow. There was no clear path ahead, no sign of civilization. I thought of my family, of my friends, of how this could turn into a nightmare if I didn't find a way out. They wouldn't even know where to start looking for me. Then, just as panic began to rise in my chest, I saw it. A small clearing ahead. There were fewer trees, and I could see a little light breaking through the fog. For the first time in hours, I felt a glimmer of hope. I pushed forward, each step feeling heavier than the last, but I couldn't stop now. I had to get out. I needed to get out. I stumbled into the clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the open space, was a small wooden structure. Cabin of sorts. It wasn't much. Just a small shack, its wood weathered and covered in patches of moss. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see the faintest light. I didn't know what possessed me to approach it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe the desperate need to find some kind of answer. I walked slowly toward the door, my heart racing. When I pushed it open, the creak of the old wood echoed in the silence. Inside was bare, no furniture, no signs of life. It was empty except for a few old crates stacked against one wall. It wasn't a home, not in the traditional sense, but it was shelter. And at that moment, shelter was all I cared about. I sat down against the wall, my legs too tired to support me any longer. My body felt like it was shutting down, but I couldn't stop my mind from racing. How had I ended up here? How could I have wandered so far off the trail? I tried to gather my thoughts, but the fog in my head wouldn't clear. My stomach growled again, but there was nothing to eat. I couldn't stay here. I knew that. The cold would soon become unbearable, and who knew how long this fog would last. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, a soft crackle of footsteps. My heart skipped. Was someone else out there? I hadn't seen anyone since the trail. I stood up slowly, trying to remain as quiet as possible, listening carefully. The footsteps got closer, but there was no voice, no sounds of conversation. I moved toward the door, peering out carefully. A figure appeared through the fog. A man, wearing a dark coat, his features hard to distinguish in the mist. He was walking with purpose, but didn't seem to notice me. I watched him for a moment, debating whether to call out or stay hidden. But then, something unexpected happened. The man stopped and turned, as if sensing my presence. Our eyes met for a brief second. "Lost?" he asked, his voice rough but calm. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. "Follow me. I know the way out." I didn't hesitate. With relief flooding my chest, I followed him as he led me through the woods, the fog still thick but no longer suffocating. His pace was steady, and despite the exhaustion in my body, I felt the tiniest spark of hope returning. He seemed to know where he was going. Maybe he had been here before. Maybe he was one of those rare people who could navigate these woods with ease. After what felt like an eternity, the fog began to lift, and the trees started to thin. The trail ahead became clearer, and I recognized the familiar path I had been on earlier. The man stopped and turned to me, his face still obscured by the mist. "You're almost there," he said simply. "It's not far." And then, without another word, he walked off, disappearing into the woods, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps as I made my way back to safety. I wasn't supposed to be out here. I knew that even as I trudged through the thick underbrush, my legs aching and my feet covered in scratches. The woods looked different now that the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The shadows stretched long and thin, and the air had that cold, crisp feel to it, like the kind of evening where you start second-guessing everything. I should have turned back hours ago, but I didn't. I was too stubborn for that. I had made the mistake of following that trail, convinced I could navigate it back to the main path. A small hike, just an hour or so out, I told myself, no big deal. But as the minutes stretched on, I realized how far off I'd gone, how the trees had become denser and the ground uneven. It all started when I noticed the path wasn't as clear anymore. The trail markers were few and far between, and the small, worn trail I'd been walking on was becoming harder to follow. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured I'd just take a few more steps, and I'd find my bearings. But the longer I went, the more lost I felt. There was nothing but trees, rows of tall, spindly trunks that looked like they went on forever. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, the roots crisscrossing like a tangled mess of veins, and the leaves, thick and damp from the recent rain, made it hard to get a good footing. I tried to backtrack, but the forest had already swallowed up my footsteps. The air was still, almost unnervingly so. I couldn't hear anything. No birds, no wind, no sound at all except for the pounding of my heart in my ears. I kept walking, telling myself that I could figure this out. I had a phone in my pocket, and I'd seen the map before I started. The idea of being lost didn't seem real to me then. But now, the quiet weighed on me, and the farther I went, the more that dread settled deep in my stomach. The branches above creaked, and I froze. I wasn't sure what I'd heard, but something made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me. The trees were so close together now, the spaces between them narrow, and the canopy above had thickened to the point where hardly any light filtered through. Felt wrong. I checked my phone, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but the screen was blank. No signal. Of course, I should have known better than to rely on it. I had a compass in my pack, though. Still, it wasn't much help when the world around me looked like an endless sea of green. Minutes turned to hours. I hadn't planned to stay out this long, but there I was. The sun was almost completely gone, and the sky was a dull, deep blue, the kind that made everything look like a shadow. I tried to steady my breathing to keep myself calm. I wasn't panicking. I told myself that, but the trees around me, they seemed taller, more imposing now, like they were watching me. The path, if you could even call it a path, had all but disappeared. I checked my watch. It was nearly 7 p.m. I should have been back by now. I knew the smart thing would be to stop and stay put until morning. But something inside of me kept pushing forward, as though I might stumble across the trail any second now. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard something. A snap, far off in the distance. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe, or even a bear. I had read that bears were active at this time of year, and I had heard the stories, how they were territorial, how they might come closer to human areas during certain seasons. But this, it didn't feel like an animal. It didn't feel like anything natural. The snap came again, closer this time. Too close. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to turn and run, but I stood frozen, listening. There was no rustling of leaves, no movement from the forest floor, just that eerie, sharp crack of a branch breaking. My mind raced. Who else could be out here? I took a slow step backward, trying to make no noise, my breath shallow. It was then that I realized how silent the forest had become. Everything had stopped. Not a bird, not a breeze. It was just me and the unsettling crackling of the branches in the distance. I had to get out. I had to find the path. I stumbled forward, heart pounding. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed louder now, like the entire forest was alive and aware of me. I had never felt so small, so exposed. I told myself not to look back, but the urge was unbearable. I had to know if I was being followed, or if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I turned my head just for a second, and that was when I saw it. In the far distance, between two massive trees, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker, someone who had gotten lost too. But as I stared, I saw the truth. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, half hidden in the shadow of the trees. And it wasn't human. It was too tall, too still. My blood ran cold. I turned away quickly, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I tried to scramble in the opposite direction. My head was spinning. I needed to get out, but the trees felt like they were closing in on me, the path I was following becoming more and more indistinct. I was lost, completely, utterly lost. Minutes, maybe hours, passed, but I didn't know how long I had been walking. The sky was dark now, and the air had turned colder. My hands were numb, my legs were stiff, and I was beginning to feel dizzy. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion or the fear, but I had started to hallucinate. In the corner of my eye, I saw the figure again. This time, it wasn't far away, not in the distance. It was right there between two trees, standing motionless. I gasped, stumbling back, but I refused to look again. Couldn't. My breath was ragged, and I pushed myself faster through the woods, hands shaking as I gripped the branches around me, pushing through the underbrush. I needed to get out, but where was the way? Then, in the distance, I saw something, a clearing, a real open space. There was light, not much, but enough to make me feel like I wasn't completely losing my mind. I bolted toward it, the last reserves of my energy fueling me forward. I stepped out into the clearing, and there it was, the road, the main road. A trailhead sign was just a few yards away, half hidden in the overgrowth. The relief was so overwhelming that I almost collapsed. I was shaking, covered in dirt, branches tangled in my hair, but I had made it. I looked back toward the woods, that dense, endless thicket of trees that had felt like it was closing in on me. But now it was just quiet, peaceful even. There was no sign of the figure, no snap of branches. Just the familiar sight of the woods behind me, harmless now. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my frantic breathing. I wasn't sure what had happened in those woods. What I'd seen, what I'd heard. It didn't make sense. Maybe it was exhaustion or the isolation, but there was no denying that I had been scared out of my mind. I didn't know if I'd ever return to those woods again, but for now I was safe. The trees were behind me, and I could finally breathe. I never thought I'd get lost in the woods. It sounds ridiculous, right? But there I was, in the middle of a forest I'd hiked through dozens of times before, completely turned around and unsure of which direction to go. It started out as a simple afternoon hike. I've always been an outdoorsy person, the kind who knows the trails, the landmarks, the difference between poison ivy and regular plants, and the sounds of the forest. I knew the woods like the back of my hand. It was supposed to be just a short hike, a little break from work. I had taken a different path this time, just to see something new. There was a small creek I'd been meaning to check out, and I figured it would be a nice detour. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a slight breeze that made the leaves rustle in the trees. The kind of day you'd want to spend outside. I followed the creek for a while, enjoying the sound of water bubbling over rocks. It was peaceful. I took a few pictures, sent them to a friend, and then kept walking. The trail wasn't marked very well, but I didn't mind. I'd been off the beaten path before. I knew how to read the land, but after a while, the creek started to widen and the trees grew denser. The sounds of the forest shifted too, the chirping of birds fading into a silence I wasn't used to. I stopped for a moment and looked around. Something about the trees seemed different, and the air felt colder. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a small knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I looked back the way I came and realized that I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I figured I'd just missed it, so I turned back and retraced my steps. But that's when I realized something wasn't right. The trees were all starting to look the same. The path I had walked was gone, as if it had never existed. I walked a little further, but it felt like I was just walking in circles. The sun was still up, but the light seemed dimmer now, like it was struggling to break through the thick canopy of leaves above. I stopped again and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I wasn't panicking yet, but the air felt too still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I knew there were no bears around here. This part of the woods wasn't known for them, but something about the silence made me feel like I was being watched. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. That always happened in these areas. The battery was at 40%, but I knew better than to rely on it. I shoved it back in my pocket and kept walking, trying to think of anything that might help me find my way back. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I knew I had to get out of here before it got dark. It wasn't a dangerous forest, but even familiar places change after nightfall. I started walking faster, my footsteps crunching on the forest floor, the sound of my breath filling the otherwise quiet air. Then I heard something. It was faint, like a soft crackling sound. At first, I thought it might have been an animal or maybe just the wind, but when I stopped and listened, I realized it was too consistent to be nature. It was something moving. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I moved quickly in the opposite direction, my heart beginning to race. The sound kept following me, always just behind me, as if whatever it was mimicking my steps. I didn't dare turn around. I kept walking and walking. Every direction I looked, it felt like the forest was closing in on me, each tree looking like a wall, trapping me in. My thoughts raced, trying to come up with a plan. But the longer I was in the woods, the less sense everything made. Then, I spotted a faint light in the distance, just a glow through the trees. For a moment, I thought it was an illusion, but I decided to make my way toward it. It had to be something, maybe a ranger station, or even another hiker, anything to break the eerie silence that had been suffocating me. I pushed through the underbrush, the light getting brighter the closer I got. The glow wasn't a campfire or a lantern, though. It was just a soft, unnatural light, like the reflection of sunlight on the leaves, but it wasn't coming from the sun. My gut told me to turn back, but I was desperate. I broke through the trees into a small clearing, and there it was, a structure, a cabin, a small, dilapidated building with broken windows and a door that hung off its hinges. The light came from within, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked abandoned, decades, maybe even longer, of wear and neglect, but the light was unmistakable. It was coming from inside. I should have turned around then, but curiosity got the best of me. I approached the cabin slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. There was no one there. The inside of the cabin was dusty and empty, the floor covered in layers of grime. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air smelled stale. But that light, It was brighter now, coming from the far corner of the room. As I stepped closer, I saw a small object on the floor, glowing faintly. It was a lantern. I reached down, my fingers trembling, and picked it up. The glow was coming from the glass itself, but the inside of the lantern was completely empty. There was no flame, no light source. I don't know why I didn't drop it immediately. Maybe I was too tired, or maybe the weirdness of the whole situation was starting to feel normal. But that's when I heard it. The sound again. Crackle. A step. A soft breathing. I spun around. The door slammed shut behind me. The room was pitch black for a moment. Then the lantern flickered back to life. But this time it wasn't just glowing. It was lighting up the entire cabin. I stood there, frozen. I wasn't alone. There was someone standing in the far corner of the cabin, their back to me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark, hunched figure. I had to get out of there. I had to. I ran to the door, the lantern lighting my way, and slammed it open. The figure didn't move. I didn't stop to look back. I sprinted through the woods, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The trees blurred around me, the ground uneven under my feet. I had no idea where I was anymore, but I kept going. The forest didn't feel like the same place anymore. It was alien, shifting, moving with every step I took. The air felt thick and heavy, almost suffocating, and every rustle in the underbrush sent a shock of fear down my spine. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, I broke through the trees. I stumbled out into an open field, the light of the setting sun finally breaking through the thick canopy above. I wasn't far from a road, and I could see a car parked in the distance. The relief I felt in that moment was indescribable. I kept running, not caring how tired I was, and made it to the road. I stopped, panting, my eyes scanning the area. I didn't see anyone else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I made my way to the nearest town after that, eventually finding a ranger station and telling them what had happened. They didn't believe me at first. Of course they didn't. But after some digging, they confirmed there was an old, long-forgotten cabin in those woods, one that had been abandoned for decades. They never found anyone in the woods, but I knew what I saw, what I heard, and I don't think I'll ever step foot in those woods again. I'm not sure what it was. A trick of the mind, maybe, some kind of mirage. But whatever it was, I'll never forget it. And I don't think I'll ever truly escape it. Started out like any normal weekend. I decided to go for a hike. Nothing special, just a long walk to clear my head. Lately, life had been feeling heavy, and the weight of everything was pressing down on me. Work was stressful, relationships complicated, and I needed a break. The woods were always my escape. Quiet, peaceful. A place where I could just breathe and forget everything for a while. The trail I took wasn't anything difficult. It was a loop, and I had hiked it dozens of times. I knew the area well enough that I didn't bother to take a map or my phone. My backpack was light. Some water, a snack, and my jacket just in case it got cold later on. The weather was perfect, clear skies and cool air that was neither too hot nor too cold. I started down the familiar path, the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots the only sound. The trees around me were tall and dense, their branches thick with leaves that blocked out much of the sunlight. The forest smelled like earth and pine, fresh and alive. The air was crisp, and I felt a sense of calm that only the woods could bring. I had been walking for about an hour when I noticed something odd. There was a branch on the trail, freshly broken, lying across my path. It wasn't there when I passed it before. My first thought was that it was just the wind, but something about it felt wrong. The break was clean, as though it had been snapped in half by something or someone. I shrugged it off, deciding it wasn't worth worrying about. The woods had always been full of odd little details that didn't mean much. As I continued on, the trail started to narrow, the trees closing in around me. The further I went, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped chirping, and the rustling of the leaves seemed distant, like I was hearing it from a long way off. I could feel a faint unease creeping in, but I ignored it. I was fine. It was just the isolation, I told myself. It always felt a little odd when you were out there alone. The path twisted and turned, and I found myself veering off the main trail. I hadn't meant to, but somehow I ended up somewhere unfamiliar. The trees were thicker here, their trunks wider and their roots twisting up from the ground like fingers trying to grasp at the sky. The air felt heavier now, more still. I should have turned around, but I kept going. I told myself I was just being paranoid, and the new route would eventually loop back to the main trail. An hour passed, maybe more. Couldn't be sure. I hadn't checked my watch since the beginning. The woods had taken on a different feeling now. The silence was oppressive. There was no wind, no birds, no sounds of any kind. It was like the world had stopped. My footsteps sounded too loud in the stillness, the crunch of the leaves unnervingly sharp. It wasn't long before I realized I was lost. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't remember how far I had walked or where I had veered off the trail. I looked around, trying to find a landmark, but there was nothing, just endless rows of trees. I started to feel the panic creeping in, my heart rate picking up, but I tried to remain calm. I was still in the woods I knew well. I had to just retrace my steps, right? But as I turned around, everything looked unfamiliar. The path I had taken was no longer there. There were no distinct features, no fallen branches, no rocks, no clearing where I had rested for a moment. Just endless trees. I checked my watch. An hour had passed since I had last looked at it. I had walked in a circle, but nothing around me felt familiar. Panic started to rise in my chest. I tried calling out, just to hear my own voice, but the sound was swallowed by the forest, leaving nothing but a deep silence. My throat tightened. I tried to stay calm. The worst thing I could do was panic. I took a deep breath and looked for any sign of a trail, any clue that would tell me which direction to go. But there was nothing. The forest stretched on in all directions, the trees so close together I couldn't see more than a few yards ahead of me. I started walking again, hoping to find something, anything, that might lead me out. The further I went, the more my steps seemed to drag. My legs felt heavier with each step, the exhaustion creeping up on me. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows that made the woods feel even more oppressive. I needed to find my way back soon or I'd be stuck here after dark. The idea of being lost at night in these woods was terrifying. There was no cell service, no one would be able to hear me if I called out. The darkness here was thick, suffocating. And then I heard something. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A snap of a branch behind me. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too loud. Someone was out there. I turned, my eyes scanning the trees. But there was nothing. No one. Just the dense forest. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe I was imagining it. But the sound came again, this time closer. I quickly spun around, but the woods were still empty. There was no one. I started walking faster, my breath coming faster, my pulse racing. I needed to get out of there and fast. The sun was setting now, and the shadows had grown long and eerie. The air was colder, and I could feel the chill creeping into my bones. I stumbled through the woods, not caring about the direction anymore. I just needed to find my way out. The trees seemed to close in on me, the path more and more difficult to follow. My feet were sore from walking so much, and I had no idea where I was going. I was disoriented, exhausted, and scared. Every little noise made me jump. The snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant bird. All of it set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The woods were no longer just an escape. They were a trap. I was alone, lost, and the daylight was slipping away fast. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, a break in the trees. It wasn't much, just a small gap in the dense forest, but it was enough. I ran toward it, my legs burning with exhaustion. As I pushed through the underbrush, I stumbled out into a small clearing, and there, at the edge, was the trail. It was faint but real, the trail I had been looking for. I sank to my knees, relief flooding through me like a wave. I had made it. I was going to get out of here. I never should have gone off the trail. It wasn't even that deep into the woods, just a couple of miles off a beaten path I'd walked dozens of times before. But that day I made a wrong turn. Or maybe I just thought I could take a shortcut. Either way, it wasn't long before the trees closed in around me, and I couldn't see the trail anymore. It's easy to get lost in the woods, and once you're lost, everything changes. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. I mean, it was still early afternoon, so there should have been the usual sounds. The rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, maybe the wind whispering through the branches. But none of that, just dead silence. I thought it was strange at first, but I shrugged it off. I figured I must have wandered farther than I realized. Maybe the sound of the wind through the trees just wasn't reaching me. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more I walked, the more I realized I couldn't find anything familiar. The trees, thick and twisted, seemed to stretch on forever, their bark dark and damp with the remnants of last night's rain. The path had disappeared completely, and I was left with nothing but the undergrowth and the feeling of being watched. That's when I noticed it, how still everything was. Not just quiet, but unnervingly still. No bugs, no animals. Not a single leaf moved in the breeze. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course, I had forgotten to download a map of the area. I always did that. I'd been here enough times to think I knew it like the back of my hand. But now I had no idea where I was. Panic crept in then. I shouldn't have gotten off the path. I shouldn't have thought I could just walk around, take a different route. But the worst part was how far the woods seemed to stretch. I didn't even know which direction I had come from anymore. I wasn't sure where I had been or where I was going. The trees were so dense, so alike. I couldn't remember if I'd passed that rock formation before or if the clearing up ahead was a new one. I took a breath, tried to calm myself. I needed to stay focused. I had to find my way out. Couldn't be that hard. Just follow the way I came, retrace my steps, and I'd find the path again. But as I walked, it became clear that my footsteps weren't leading me anywhere familiar. I tried not to panic. It wasn't like I had gotten completely lost, right? I could still find my way. I could turn around, retrace my steps. But each turn I made seemed to bring me deeper into the woods. The trees became thicker, the underbrush more tangled. My feet kept slipping in the wet leaves. I could feel the sweat gathering at the back of my neck, even though it wasn't that hot outside. Hours passed. At least I think they did. Couldn't be sure. I didn't have a watch and my phone was dead by then. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. I had no choice but to keep moving. The woods weren't forgiving after dark. The further I went, the more disorienting it became. Every turn felt like it led to the same place, or worse, a place I didn't recognize. The trees were too tall, the branches too tangled. I had no reference points, nothing familiar to anchor me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tell if it was because I was afraid or because I was running low on energy. My legs were starting to ache, my stomach growling. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and I had no water with me. My throat was dry, and every time I swallowed, it felt like I was swallowing sand. And then, when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard it. A crack, a twig snapping. I froze, holding my breath. My heart skipped a beat. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Person? The silence was suffocating. It had been so quiet all this time, but now something was breaking it. I strained my ears, but I couldn't hear anything more.
No rustling.
No more snapping twigs. The woods were as still as they had been before. I couldn't tell if I had just imagined it, or maybe I had been in this forest so long that my mind was starting to play tricks on me. I kept moving, but I kept hearing things. Small sounds, branches breaking, leaves shifting. Not much, but enough to make me second-guess myself. I felt eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anything. I was starting to think that maybe I wasn't alone in these woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. Then it happened again. A loud crack, followed by a soft rustle. This time, I didn't freeze. I started walking faster, my breath coming quicker. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to look, but I couldn't. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stand still. I didn't know what was out there, but I didn't want to find out. The trees around me seemed to grow thicker, their trunks pressing in, narrowing my path. It felt like they were closing in on me, trapping me. My steps were hurried, clumsy. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my legs feeling heavier with every step. I was slipping, falling behind myself. And then, in the midst of all that confusion, I saw something. A small clearing up ahead. I moved toward it instinctively. It was a break in the trees, a chance to catch my breath, to get a better sense of where I was. As I pushed through the last few branches, I stepped into the open space, and that's when I saw it. A cabin. It was old, weathered, and nearly swallowed by the surrounding woods. But it was there. There was no mistaking it. A cabin in the middle of nowhere. I didn't know whether to feel relief or terror. Relief because it meant I wasn't as far from civilization as I thought. Terror because I had no idea who or what might be living in that cabin. The door was shut, but I could see a faint light flickering through the cracks in the wood. I knew I had to decide quickly. Stay in the open, exposed to whatever might be lurking in the woods, or approach the cabin, unsure of who or what might be inside. There was no easy choice, but the cabin seemed like my best chance. I didn't know if anyone lived there, but I couldn't just stand in the clearing all night. I took a deep breath and made my way to the door. The wood creaked under my weight, and my heart was racing in my chest. My hand shook as I reached for the door. The knob turned, and I pushed it open, bracing myself for whatever lay inside. The cabin was empty. The light I had seen came from an old kerosene lamp, sitting on a wooden table by the window. The place smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for years. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. The fire pit in the center of the room had long since gone cold, the ashes scattered on the stone. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, taking a moment to collect myself. The woods outside were terrifying, but at least I was inside now, safe for the moment. I didn't know what had brought me to this place, but as I looked around, I realized something that struck me like a punch to the gut. There was no sign of anyone, no signs of life, no evidence that anyone had been here recently. Yet the lamp was burning. Someone had to have been here. I searched the cabin in a frenzy, opening drawers, looking behind the furniture, but there was nothing. No food.
No supplies.
Nothing. I finally sat down on the floor, exhausted, defeated. I had no idea how I had ended up here, but one thing was clear. I wasn't alone in the woods, and I needed to find my way out before whatever it was that had been following me found me first. The sun had been setting for what felt like hours, its soft orange light weaving between the branches above. I glanced at my watch. It was well past 6 now. I should have started heading back long before, but I was too distracted. I had come into these woods just to clear my head. A simple hike, a way to disconnect for a few hours. I didn't plan on being out here as the darkness crept in. It was supposed to be a short trail. I had a map with me, a water bottle, and a light jacket. I was well prepared for what I thought would be a simple afternoon walk. But the forest had a way of swallowing time. The deeper I went, the more the surroundings changed. The path had become less clear, less obvious. The trees thickened, the underbrush grew taller, and before I knew it, the landmarks I thought I remembered were nowhere to be found. I retraced my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The trail markers that had been so clear when I first started were now hidden under overgrown branches and moss. My heart began to race as I glanced around, the sounds of birds and insects filling the air with an eerie hush, as if the forest was holding its breath. A sense of unease crept into my chest. I tried to push it away, telling myself I just needed to stay calm. There was no reason to panic. It was just a forest, after all. But it was getting darker. The shadows stretched longer across the ground, and the familiar warmth of the sun faded, replaced by the cool bite of night. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping for a message, maybe a call, something to ground me. The screen was dead. I had forgotten to charge it. Of course, I swallowed hard. Okay, just focus. I turned around again, trying to find something, anything that might look familiar, but all I saw were towering trees and tangled vines. I felt a slight panic rise in my throat, but forced it down. I couldn't let myself get caught up in it. I took a deep breath and started walking in what I hoped was the right direction. The trail had disappeared. What I was walking on now was little more than a vague path through the forest, overgrown with thick weeds and roots. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest, and I could hear nothing but my own footsteps crunching on the underbrush. I pushed forward, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under branches that seemed to reach out, clawing at my skin. As the minutes passed, I began to lose track of time. Every tree looked the same. Every turn felt like it led me deeper into the woods. I felt the weight of the silence, as if the forest was somehow more alive than it should be. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My breaths grew shorter, and my legs began to ache. The fear I had tried to suppress crept back in, a tight knot in my stomach. It was then that I heard something, a snap, like a twig breaking behind me. My body froze, my heart pounded in my chest. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing, only the deepening shadows and the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, the woods playing tricks on me. I kept walking, but every few steps, I thought I heard another noise, a crack of a branch or the rustling of leaves. It was like something was following me, always just out of sight. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. I knew that much. The thought chilled me to the core. Was it an animal? Person? I tried to remember the basic survival tips I'd read online, but everything felt distant and useless in the moment. Minutes turned into hours. My mind raced with thoughts, trying to piece together any way to get out of this. I knew I had to stay calm, but the more I walked, the more desperate I became. I stopped at what I thought was a clearing, hoping for some sign of civilization. But all I found was more trees, more unrelenting forest. No roads, no signs, nothing. Just the unbroken canopy above me and the deep, quiet stillness around me. I was lost, really lost. As the last remnants of daylight disappeared, the forest seemed to close in around me. The darkness was complete now, suffocating. I fumbled in my jacket for a flashlight, but of course, I hadn't brought one. I hadn't planned for this. My thoughts spiraled into panic. my legs feeling like lead as I stumbled forward, trying to find my bearings. That's when I heard it again, the unmistakable snap of a twig. This time it was closer. A chill ran down my spine, and I whirled around, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing, just the shadows. But my mind was racing now. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was no logical reason for the fear building up inside me, but it was undeniable. I had to do something. I kept moving, my breathing shallow, my senses on high alert. I could barely think straight. There had to be a way out of here. There just had to be. The thought of spending another night in the woods was unbearable. I needed to find a way back. I needed to. Another snap. Closer. I wasn't imagining it this time. I stood frozen, the panic taking over. My eyes darted around, desperately searching for any sign of movement. A shadow flickered behind a tree, just for a moment, and my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I stood there, heart racing, waiting for the sound to come again. But it didn't. The forest was silent once more. I took a shaky step forward, then another. I was going to keep moving no matter what. I had to. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run as fast as I could. But I forced myself to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Panic was an anchor, weighing me down, but I couldn't afford to let it control me. Then, a distant light flickered in the distance. My eyes locked onto it, and my heart leaped in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. I ran towards the light, the fear spurring me on, pushing my body beyond its limits. The darkness seemed to press in even tighter, but the light was getting closer. It wasn't until I broke through the thick underbrush that I saw it. An old hunting cabin nestled between two large oaks, its warm light spilling out from a window. I reached the door, pounding on it with both hands. I didn't care who or what was inside. I was desperate. The door opened slowly, and a grizzled man in his late 50s stood there, blinking at me in surprise. "What the hell are you doing out here, kid?" he asked. I'm lost," I gasped, my voice trembling. "I've been out here for hours. Please, I need help." He took one look at me, then stepped aside. "Come in." As soon as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and the warmth of the cabin wrapped around me like a blanket. I collapsed into a chair by the fire, breathing heavily. "I thought I was going to die out there," I said, trying to steady my racing heartbeat. The man looked at me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Ain't nobody ever dies out here if they know how to listen to the woods." "You didn't." I was too tired to ask more questions. I just sat there, staring into the fire, feeling the last of the panic ebb away. I had been lost, but I wasn't anymore. I was safe. I thought the woods would be a simple trail hike, just a few hours of peaceful solitude in the wild, but the deeper I went, the more I started to feel wrong. It wasn't just the dense trees, the way they seemed to loom over me as I walked. It wasn't just the quiet, either, though that was unsettling in its own way. It was more than that. It was the feeling of being watched. I didn't know who or what was watching me. There were no other hikers, no sounds of birds or animals. Nothing. Just me, the path, and the heavy silence. I had been hiking for a few hours, and the map I had seemed simple enough. A loop trail, something easy, something beginner-friendly. It should have been a quick, relaxing getaway from my busy life. But the deeper I went, the less certain I became. The trail seemed to shift in subtle ways, taking me farther off the path I remembered. It wasn't as clear anymore. The markers were becoming harder to spot. I kept telling myself I was just overthinking it, that this was just part of the woods. But the woods weren't like I expected. They were different than the parks near my home. These trees felt older, somehow like they had stories of their own that they weren't eager to share. I checked my watch. 3:15 p.m. I still had plenty of daylight left, so I decided to push on. But after another hour, I realized that the familiar markers, the trail signs, were gone. I turned around, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The trees had a way of shifting, twisting, bending in ways that seemed too intentional, as though the forest itself was leading me astray. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal, just a few faint bars, flickering and disappearing. The battery was low, and I couldn't remember if I'd charged it enough this morning. My heart rate increased. I tried to calm myself down. This was just a small detour. There's no need to panic. But the silence of the woods was suffocating now. Every snap of a twig underfoot felt too loud. The trees were growing closer together, blocking the sky, creating a canopy that made everything feel dim and suffocating. I kept walking, trying to remember the path, but my footsteps grew heavier with each step, like the earth was pulling me deeper. My legs were starting to ache. Sweat gathered at the back of my neck, and I wiped it away with the sleeve of my jacket. The forest felt different now, oppressive almost. I felt like I wasn't alone, like something or someone was just beyond the trees, waiting. But every time I turned around, there was nothing, just the same endless trees. The thought of turning back should have been comforting. I'd gone off track, sure, but I could always retrace my steps, find the right way again. But it didn't feel that simple anymore. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There was no clear path back, and I didn't trust the ground I walked on anymore. Felt unfamiliar, hostile. Each turn I made seemed to get me deeper, further from the way out. It was getting dark, quicker than I had expected. The sky above me, once a clear blue, was turning a dull shade of gray. I checked my watch again. 4:45 p.m. The sun was setting faster than I remembered. I tried to calm myself, but the woods felt like they were closing in on me. It wasn't just the lack of landmarks, it was something deeper, like I was being pulled into something. I had to make a decision. Keep walking or stop and wait for help. But how could I stop? Every part of me screamed to keep moving. Yet, the more I walked, the more I realized the trail wasn't a trail anymore. It was just a path through an endless stretch of trees. I paused, listening. I thought I heard something, rustling in the underbrush behind me. But when I spun around, I saw nothing. My pulse raced. I was losing my grip. I was losing time. I kept going, my mind in a haze of panic and exhaustion. I couldn't tell if I was retracing my steps or getting farther into the forest. The world around me was becoming more of a blur, the shadows deepening. The next few hours passed in a blur of confusion, frustration, and dread. I couldn't tell if the night was closing in on me or if it was the forest itself that had swallowed the sun. My watch was dead, the last bit of battery drained. My phone was useless now. I couldn't see the sky. The trees were so thick above me. I had no sense of direction anymore. I didn't want to admit it, but I was terrified. Terrified that I wasn't going to find my way out. Terrified that the woods weren't as empty as they seemed. The silence was deafening now. I hadn't heard a single bird or animal since I entered the forest. Not one sound from any living thing. Only the rustle of leaves under my boots and the wind, always a little too much, as though something else was moving in the trees with me. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A flicker of light ahead, a break in the trees. I wasn't sure if it was real, but it was there. It was distant but unmistakable. A soft, yellowish glow through the trees. I pushed forward, ignoring the thorns and branches that snagged my clothes. I was desperate now, beyond fear. I moved faster, stumbling over rocks and fallen branches, until the light grew clearer, and I realized I was at the edge of the forest. I stepped out of the trees and into an open field. My chest heaved as I sucked in a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air, free from the weight of the woods. It was a small clearing, a patch of grass that stretched to a dirt road. The kind of road you'd expect to see on a map, the kind that led somewhere. I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the dimming light. It was peaceful now, far from the suffocating darkness I'd left behind. I kept walking, following the road, until I finally saw a car parked in the distance. I quickened my pace, and when I got closer, I saw a figure standing by the car, just a person, waiting. It was a woman. She smiled when she saw me, her face illuminated by the car's headlights. I was too relieved to be confused. She opened the door, and without a word, I climbed in. She didn't ask any questions, but I didn't care. I was out. When I looked back one last time, I saw the woods stretching beyond the edge of the road, dark and still. They seemed so far away now, so distant. As the car drove away, I could have sworn I saw something move in the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone.